Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today on Crafty Criminals. I'm Christine, I'm doing crafts, and we're going to talk about criminals. I hope you guys had a great day and that your week has been fantastic. Mine's going pretty awesome. Been really busy, but it's good, and now I get to do crafts with you and talk about one of my favorite topics, true crime. So, what we're talking about today is a case that you likely have not heard of. If you have, kudos to you, but I seriously had not heard about this. I'm going to just give you a quick summary and then we're all on the same page before we get started. So, this case is one of the largest mass kidnapping cases in US history. It is so crazy, it does not seem like it could even be real. The case we're talking about is generally known as the Chowchilla kidnappings. A busload of kids carrying 26 children was hijacked, kidnapped, and then buried alive. Buried alive. This story, honestly, it is so insane, and I was not able to find a lot of information or a lot of work done on it. If you're a novelist or a screenwriter, this would be the case to make like a movie or a novel about. It is so crazy. Like, it's an unbelievable story. There are so many shocking twists and turns in this story. You're seriously going to be hanging onto your glue guns on the edge of your craft chair when you hear this story. So now that I got you caught up on the background of it, we're going to get right into it. There are 3 perpetrators in this case, but we're going to mainly talk about the quote-unquote ringleader, Frederick Woods. We're going to call him Fred. Fred was born October 15th, 1951, just outside of San Francisco, into a very wealthy family. And when I say wealthy, I mean like filthy, stinking rich. Their money went back generation after generation. Fred went without nothing. Everything he wanted, he was given. He was spoilt rotten. The only thing Fred didn't have were a present parental figure. His parents, Fred Sr. and Harriet, did a lot of traveling, and they did not take Fred with them. Fred grew up in the Santa Cruz Mountains in a very wealthy community. And although, as I said, he was rich, he was very lonely. He did not have any friends, and even though he was not an only child, Fred's sister was born when he was 6 years old, and when she was born, she was diagnosed with Down syndrome. When his parents received the diagnosis, they put his sister into care, and then Fred never heard or saw her again. There really isn't any information that I can find about her. Fred's parents were so removed and disconnected from his life that there's no family pictures of him. There's pictures of Fred by himself, and there's pictures of his mom and dad on vacations, but nothing as a family together. The only thing Fred wanted in his life was his father's approval and love, and he got none of that. As far as Fred Sr. was concerned, Fred was a failure in every aspect of his life. He was not good in school. He could not hold a job as he got older. He did nothing for himself. He had no motivation. He had no circle of friends. He wasn't invited to social events. When Fred was 19, he got married. And his isolation really didn't change even then. He did not spend time with his wife, and it said that he didn't even actually like her. Their marriage lasted less than a year, and guess what? That was just one more thing that Fred Sr. used against his son. Just saw him as a failure. After his divorce, Fred slipped further and further into isolation. His father decided to try and hire him at a rock quarry that he owned. This quarry was called the California Rock and Gravel Company. remember this fact. We're going to come back to it a little later. How strong I am bending steel. Shortly after Fred started working at the quarry, he started hanging out with two men that he'd never hung out with before. Like I said, Fred didn't have friends, and so him spending time with two people was noticeable. These people were Jim and Rich Schoenfeld. They were brothers, and I don't know when they were born. I do know that they were 2 years apart. They were also from a very wealthy family, not wealthy like Fred's family, but wealthy nonetheless. They did have a similar childhood in that they were spoiled and entitled. All three men went to the same school, but weren't friends while they were growing up. Actually, Jim and Fred had graduated the same year, but did not spend any time together. I'm not for sure how they started hanging out, but I do know that there's some speculation because Fred was into buying old cars. He called Jim up and asked him if he'd be interested in helping him fix some of them up. And Jim agreed as long as he could bring his little brother, and that's how their friendship started. As they started fixing these cars, they started thinking about and opening a used car business. Fixing cars leaves a lot of time on your hands for chatting and complaining. The three men complained a lot about their parents mostly, and how they weren't being given enough money, if you can believe that. Their parents weren't giving them enough money. They deserved more. So, as time went on, for whatever reason, all three men had been financially cut off by their families right around the same time. Well, they needed money, obviously. They're used to living a life of luxury and buying whatever they wanted. So they had to come up with a way to make money. Instead of going out and getting a job like you or I would, they figured they could find an easier way to make money. So they came up with this plan that they were going to just start stealing cars. And this didn't go as well as they thought it would. Didn't take long before they were caught. They were convicted and charged with grand theft, but their parents bailed them out, and all they got was some community service. Since this criminal gig had very little consequence and a lot of payoff, they figured this was the right road for them, but they needed something bigger and better. So with all their free time, as I said, they started watching a lot of movies about bank robberies and ransom cases, and they decided that they were definitely clever enough to come up with a plan for some really, really big money. However, they obviously aren't great criminals. They just got caught for stealing cars. Like, how crafty are you if you've already been caught for stealing cars? I don't think now is the time to move up in your game if you haven't mastered the basics, but this is what they've decided. They figured that kidnapping for ransom seemed like the easiest way to make money. But kidnapping one child for ransom wasn't going to get you the kind of money you wanted. You needed it to be several children for it to be a payoff. Over the course of a year, they plotted and planned. They spent an entire year coming up with their diabolical plan, which was to kidnap a bus load of children and demand a ransom of $5 million. On July 15th, 1976, in California, it was a hot day in Chowchilla. It was the second last day of school, summer school, for the Dairyland elementary students. The kids rode bus together every day in this small farming community, which was just 100 miles outside of San Francisco. This community was a very close-knit community, the kind where everybody knows each other. And back in the 1970s, It was very normal to know your neighbors and probably everybody on your street. But in Chowchilla, everyone knew everyone. The kids were driven back and forth to school on a bus by a man named Ed Ray. Ed was in his 50s and had been driving school bus for decades. In fact, Ed was the bus driver to most of these children's parents. Ed took his job very seriously, and the bus ran like clockwork, always arriving on time. So on this morning, on the 15th, they left for school. In summer school, they would go to the school, get some work done, and in the afternoon, they would usually go on an outing. So on this particular day, the children were going swimming. The children had all had a wonderful time swimming. They were excitedly chatting as they were driving back home on the narrow country roads, singing songs, sharing their favorite parts of the day, and very excited that the next day was their last day in summer school. However, their cheerful day was about to take a dramatic turn, changing their lives forever. Ed had already made a few stops and had dropped off several children. There were 26 children still on board with Ed, and as he turned down a narrow country road, a white van was blocking the entire road. As I said, in Chowchilla, nothing happened. Everybody felt safe there. It was a quiet farming community. There wasn't traffic, there wasn't crime. So for somebody to be stopped on the road, you would assume that they were in trouble, that their car had broken down, and that they needed help. Somebody like Ed, who grew up there, would never consider that there was an ulterior motive to being there. Ed slowed the bus and stopped right in front of the van. And as he did, 3 men jumped out of the van, holding shotguns and wearing pantyhose or nylons, tights, whatever you call them, over their faces, covering and distorting their facial features. And they started screaming while pointing their guns right at Ed. Do not consider backing up. Do not consider trying to get away. We will kill you. So Ed froze. He just sat there trying to figure out what he should do. And as he's sitting, the men come right up to the door and they're demanding that Ed open that bus door. Can you imagine? You're the bus driver and you're sitting there with 26 kids in the back of your bus, and there's 3 masked men with guns demanding to get on your bus. You're in a no-win situation. Like, here's the bus handle. You open that door and you let them on. You're letting them on with those 26 kids. But if you don't open the door, they're going to kill you anyway and still get on the bus. But they won't have a trusted adult with them. Ed felt like he didn't really have much choice but to comply. So reluctantly, Ed opened the door and Rich, Jim, and Fred boarded the bus. The kids were terrified. They were all screaming and crying. So the men started pointing their guns at them, which obviously just hypes up hysterics. Nobody's calming down when there's a gun in your face. Jim yells as loud as he can for everybody to shut up. So Fred orders Ed to get out of the driver's seat and to walk and sit at the very back of the bus. Ed gets up and tries to silently comfort all the kids as he walks by, giving them a smile or a little squeeze on their shoulders, just letting them know that it was going to be okay. Jim jumped into the driver's seat of the bus, and Rich got off the bus and went out to get into the van. Fred stood at the front of the bus, turned around so he was facing the children, and pointed his gun at them. Once Rich was in the van, the bus fired up and started down the road with the white van following behind them. Obviously, a bright yellow school bus isn't going unnoticed. And the next step in their plan would be to hide the bus. They drive for about 30 minutes to a dry riverbed that was completely overgrown with bamboo. The bamboo was so tall that it easily concealed the school bus. They drove in and parked the bus, which was right next to a second van. These men had planned well enough that they had another van waiting there. They pulled the van and backed it right up to the door strategically so that anybody getting off the bus would not step foot onto the ground, leaving footprints or evidence of any kind. They would step directly from bus to van. One by one, they had each child walk down the aisle and load into the van. The vans had both been modified just specifically for the kidnapping. The windows were painted over. Every crack, every crevice, every hole, anything that would allow light to penetrate through was filled. There you had wood panels that covered the floor, the sides, and the roof of the vans, making this a very, very dark, mobile prison. As Ed steps out of the bus into the van, he clued in immediately that this was a planned kidnapping. He had no choice but to stay calm and obviously not say anything to any of the kids about what he thought was happening. So once all 27 of their prisoners are loaded up and in the vans, the three men jump in and drive away. Once the van doors were closed, it was so black, as I said, they literally could not see their hands in front of their faces. Never mind see who was sitting beside you or where you were going. They were literally in the dark. They could tell, though, the first roads they took were country back roads because they were being jostled and bounced from side to side. And then finally onto a paved, smoother road where they drove for hours. Mid-July in California, the temperature would have been insane. There was no way for fresh air to get in. There was no food and no water. The children were starting to vomit from, I'm sure, fear and car sickness. There wasn't a bathroom. And because they were driving for so long, inevitably people started needing to use the bathroom. So Ed decided that they would designate the middle of the bus for the bathroom. That way the perimeter of the bus where everybody was sitting would be mess free and they wouldn't be sitting in their own feces. They drove for 12 hours in the blistering heat. 12 hours stuck without anything to drink, without proper air, without a place to use the bathroom. By this time, back in Chowchilla, parents are starting to realize that their kids are late. And as I said, this bus ran like clockwork. Now, it never is going to pop right into their mind that something bad has happened. It's the 1970s and it's in a small community. Everybody knows everybody. They assume, of course, that it's likely that the bus has broken down somewhere. They send out a search party looking and they cannot find it anywhere. At around 7:30 p.m., so approximately 3 hours after the children had all gone missing, the police use a helicopter and send the helicopter up, and they are able to spot the bus. And the hard part for any parent to have heard, the first thing you hear is they found the bus. The next thing you hear is your kids are not with it. The police had hope, though. They did believe that the children were alive. And that's because when they did find the bus and start looking around that area, they saw that there were 2 other sets of tire tracks, making them believe that this was a planned kidnapping and likely for ransom. So now the FBI is involved. By now this has made the news, not just nationwide, but worldwide news. Back to our kidnappers and our 26 kids. They're still driving in these hot, stuffy vans towards the rock quarry, the same one we talked about earlier. This rock quarry was only about 100 miles away, and we know that it doesn't take 12 hours to go 100 miles. But they needed to get to the rock quarry in the middle of the night. So essentially, they had to drive for 12 hours aimlessly, killing time until they felt that they could safely get to the quarry and nobody else would be there. They arrived at the quarry at about 4 a.m. and they drove the vans over into a far off area of the quarry, right next to a large hole in the ground with a ladder sticking out of it. Fred swung the van door open and first grabbed Ed, dragged Ed out, and slammed the door again right behind him, not giving the children any opportunity to see what was going on. They wanted Ed out first because he, being the only adult, was really the only one they felt would pose any threat to them. Once they had him dealt with, the rest would be easy. Men ordered Ed to climb down that ladder underground. Ed again complies, feeling he does not have much choice if he wants to keep those kids safe. As Ed climbs down the ladder, an entire room opens up and he's standing in a large open space. It takes a few minutes for his eyes to adjust and realize this is not a room, but a semi-truck trailer. So the men above ground now are opening the van door and taking children out one by one, standing them in front of them, asking for their full name, their address, their phone number, and an article of clothing. They would need all of this information in order to be able to claim any ransom for them. They would have to know which parents to contact, and also they wanted to ensure that they had proof that they did have these kids. Once each child gave them the clothing and the information, they were also forced down the manhole into the underground trailer. The kids waiting in the dark bus for their turn were clinging to the walls, terrified that they were being pulled out and killed. They had no idea what was going on or what was happening. It wasn't an easy task, but the men did eventually get all 26 children and their driver underground and into the makeshift prison. Now that they're all down there, they're looking around, and there is a small lamp in the corner that barely sheds enough light to see anything. There's some mattresses strewn on the floor, some makeshift toilets that were made out of wooden boxes with holes cut in them, a small table in the corner with some food and water on it. Not very much though, maybe enough food and water for 4 people, but definitely not for 27 of them. Now the men yell down the manhole, like, "We'll be back for you!" And they pull the ladder up and seal the hole shut with a metal plate. And on top of that metal plate, they placed 2 very large truck batteries, weighing about 100. Suddenly, they could all hear the distinct sound of dirt being shoveled and hitting the metal plate. This is when they realized they were being buried alive. So let's break this down. They're using the rock quarry owned by Fred's dad. They hired diggers to dig a giant hole, a hole big enough to fit a trailer in. Have this hole dug with a ramp going down it. That's how they got the truck trailer in there, is they physically drove the truck and trailer down a ramp and underground. The truck, by the way, was purchased by Fred's dad's money. I'm sure he was so pleased to hear that. Once they had the truck and trailer underground, they modified it to house their hostages, making the wood toilets, carrying down mattresses, bringing some food and water down for them, and installing a very weak, very poorly built ventilation system. I'm actually shocked that they thought of ventilation. Once it was complete, they buried the entire rig underground, even leaving only that small manhole with a ladder sticking out of it to get in and out of. From above ground, there was absolutely no evidence that this trailer even existed. You could literally be standing over top of it and you would have no idea that it was there. So now it's the 16th of July. The 27 of them are buried. The manholes being covered by the plate and their truck batteries, then buried again. So their plan was well underway. The three men then head over to Fred's house. Now was the big moment, the one that they really been waiting for. They were gonna get to call in their ransom demands. They pick up the phone. I remember it's the 1970s. They pick up the phone. And they dial the number and they wait. But all the lines are ringing back busy. As I said, this made world news. So the call lines are being flooded by people. Friends, family, media, journalists, concerned citizens. And I'm sure a small town like Chowchilla is not set up or equipped with enough manpower and phone lines to take the amount of calls they were getting. So after the three of them try and still cannot get through to make their demands, they decided that they would have to come up with another idea. But in the meantime, they were exhausted. I mean, think about it. They worked really hard. They had 27 hostages, 2 vans, a hidden bus, and 12 hours of driving. Like, a nap would be the obvious choice. So all of them get snuggled in and lay down for their very well-deserved sleep. But this nap would be actually their downfall. By this time, the 27 people underground are in a worse situation than they even had been hours before that, if you can believe it. Ed has spent the last few hours scouring the trailer for any possible escape. He was kicking the walls, feeling along the sides of it, hoping for any crack, any weakness, anywhere that he might be able to find a way for them to get out. It was getting very stuffy in there and extremely hard to breathe. There was a ventilation system, as I mentioned, but it wasn't well constructed and it was very weak. It was basically just a hose, and it was running through the top of the trailer to above ground and was attached to a very, very tiny fan. So it wasn't doing a whole lot for them. They're almost out of food and water. The kids are starting to get frantic. I cannot imagine what they all were going through. It's July. There's no ventilation. There's no air. You're buried alive in a metal trailer overflowing with feces. You have nothing to eat or drink, and so far, no possible way out. I would definitely be in hysterics too. Ed tried very hard to keep all the kids calm and to keep them sitting still, because he knew the more they cried, the more they panicked, the more oxygen they were using up. They'd been underground at this point for 12 hours. And now that tiny ventilation system has stopped working altogether because the fan ran out of batteries. You made a ventilation system and put batteries into it. Okay, but that wasn't their biggest issue, if you can even believe that. They had a bigger one. The ceiling was starting to cave in. This trailer that they'd put underground was old, like dilapidated kind of old. And then they had dumped a load of dirt on top of it. So of course it's gonna start caving. And as the roof is caving, the sides are starting to bow. Ed and probably some of the older kids had started to realize that there really was no way out. They were either going to suffocate, starve, or be crushed. They were literally about to die. All while Fred, Rich, and Jim are still napping. Isn't that darling? One of the 26 kidnapped children was a 14-year-old boy named Mike Marshall. He was the oldest child there. Mike obviously understood that this was a do or die situation. And he just decided he was getting everyone out. He was very driven and truly in his heart believed he could get everyone out. Mike told Ed that he thought the only way out was the same way that they came in. They had to go through the manhole in the ceiling. Ed was very skeptical. He didn't first off think that they would manage to get out that way, but if they did, the three men could be standing, waiting, expecting them to come through that hole and just kill them as they exited. Mike agreed. It was a huge risk that those guys could be there. On the other hand, death was inevitable, staying where they were. So the only logical choice to Mike was that they take that risk and try and escape. They started piling the mattresses, and they piled and piled and piled them until Mike and Ed were able to reach the metal plate on top, and they tried to just push it. It did not move. The metal plate itself was heavy, but on top of that, it had 200 pounds of batteries. I do not know how he found the strength to keep going, but he just kept wiggling and wiggling and wiggling and pushing and doing everything he possibly could until suddenly it budged just a little. And that gave them another push to keep trying. They continued to push and push and push until they got enough space, just enough for Mike to stick his arm up through the hole and try and feel what was on top of it. He had his arm out and he was feeling around. He could feel that there were two objects, but he did not know what they were. So they started to rock the plate back and forth until they were able to move the batteries off of the plate. This took them hours, and so much of their strength. Eventually, they were able to move the plate enough for Mike himself to pull through the hole. All the kids were so excited. They were escaping. Sadly, though, the celebration was short-lived. Once Mike climbed through that hole, he realized they weren't free at all. He instead found himself inside a wooden box that was also buried underground. Unbeknownst to the people below, before the trio left, they placed a wooden box over top of the manhole, burying the box in the dirt. No matter how hard Mike pushed on this wooden box, it did not budge. The letdown that would have been, you were just on a high thinking you have escaped and freed 26 other people with you. And suddenly you realize you are no further than you were before. At this point, Ed was almost completely deflated, physically and emotionally. He just couldn't do it anymore. Mike, however, refused to give up. He just continued. He sat in that hole in the box and kicked and pushed, unwilling to stop until he was dead or out. After beating on that box for such a long time, the roof of the box gave way just a little bit, but this was all the fuel Mike needed to carry on. He could see the dirt above the box and continued to hit it until he was able to get his hands in there and just start digging. He dug and dug until suddenly the box started to flood with soil, followed by a huge burst of sunshine coming through, and Mike was rushed by the freshest, cleanest air he had ever breathed in his life. However, he is still cautiously aware that there could be potential danger on the other side. Those three men, as Ed said, could very well be standing there waiting to kill him the moment he pokes his head above ground. Despite how scared he was, Mike pulls himself out of the hole onto the ground above and steps out into the outside world, ready to face whatever possibility, whatever danger might be there. But as he looks around, he realizes there's no one there. He calls down the manhole to Ed, saying that the coast is clear. And once he's sure, Ed starts hoisting children up through the hole into freedom. So on July 16th, more than 24 hours after being kidnapped, all 27 of them had finally escaped. But even though they're now above ground, it isn't over. They find themselves standing in the middle of nowhere. It's not like they have cell phones. They can't call somebody. In their heads, they drove 12 hours. They just knew they needed to get to safety. And as they're standing there, they suddenly become aware of the hum of large machinery being run somewhere nearby. Obviously, this is scary because they don't know who's running that machine. It could very well be those 3 kidnappers. But in the vulnerable state they were in, they didn't really have any other choice but to head in the direction of the noise they could hear. They start walking towards the machines, and suddenly they spot some construction workers who were still at the quarry that evening. And as soon as Ed sees them, he starts shouting, "We're from Chowchilla! We're from Chowchilla! We need help!" And the construction workers hear them. And immediately they know who these people are. Because, as I said, this had made worldwide news. So the men called the police immediately. And finally, the children and Ed were rescued. All of them had been taken to a medical facility to get checked out and make sure that they were all physically okay. And at around midnight, they sent a Greyhound bus to transport Ed and the 26 children back to Chowchilla. A lot of the kids, though, were very apprehensive about getting on the bus. I mean, I don't think you could really blame them. Like I said, the youngest kid was 5 years old. The last time they were on a bus, they were kidnapped and buried alive. I don't think being a little apprehensive is odd at all. I think that should have been expected. They were able to finally convince all of them to get on this bus, and they take them back to their hometown. And as they pull into the Chowchilla police station around 4 a.m., all of their parents are there waiting for them. That moment, as a parent, you have just had the worst 24 hours in your life. I mean, nothing compared to what your kids have gone through, but you thought they could possibly be dead, and here they are coming off this bus. Or as this 5-year-old child, seeing your mom and dad and having them scoop you up into their arms, I don't think is a joy that anybody could understand unless they had been in that situation. But in the meantime, let's not forget about our 3 sleeping beauties. They finally do wake up from their nap. And they stretch and flip the TV on, only to discover that all 27 hostages have not only escaped, but made it back home. That despite the hours and hours, the year of planning, they were outsmarted by 26 children. The funny part to me is that they didn't even get to make their ransom demands. That would be a big deal to you, because that's where you're going to find that power and that control. You're demanding something of not only the police department, but the state. I found that pretty, like a very happy moment. You know, you gotta find something. So the men obviously realize that it's over for them. Jim and Fred decide to take off and run. Rich stays behind but lays low. The police start investigating, but the kids and Ed weren't able to give a good description of the kidnappers because they'd worn pantyhose on their face the whole time. So they didn't know what they looked like. They just knew that there were 3 of them. So the police started back in the trailer and on the quarry. They were asking around and asked security. The security did say that a few months prior, they had seen 3 men digging a very large hole. And one of those men just happened to be the owner's son, Fred Woods. So the police look into who this Fred is and realize he'd been convicted of grand theft auto, which then directly leads them to Jim and Rich, who were also convicted of the same things. So once they get their search warrant, they go over to Fred Woods' house and found everything they needed. They literally found a piece of paper that on the top said plan, and then underneath were bullet points detailing every point of what they were going to do in this plan. They also found a draft of the ransom note demanding $5 million. How do you think you're getting away with something that would take a lot of planning and intelligence when your first smart thought is to sit down and write, plan how I'm going to kidnap 27 children? And then if you're going to run away, take the paper with you. At the very least, take the paper with you. Or destroy it would make more sense. So Rich turned himself in, and shortly after, they were able to capture Jim, who was trying to make his way across the United States. It took about 2 weeks for them to get a hold of Fred, and they did find Fred in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and they brought him back to face justice. When asked why they did this, Jim said that even though they were all quite wealthy, or their families were wealthy, Fred and Jim were quite deep in debt. And when asked, why a busload of children? He replied, we needed multiple victims to get multiple millions. And we picked children because children are precious. And we knew that the state would be willing to pay ransom for them. And children don't fight back. However, it wasn't that straightforward. Although all three men did plead guilty to 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom, for whatever reason, they all three refused to bend on the 8 counts of bodily harm. This, of course, set the trial back quite far and drug it out longer. 16 months after they were abducted and buried alive, some of these kids were brave enough to take the stand and to share their story of the trauma that they went through, but also that they were actually caused bodily harm. That the lack of oxygen, the lack of food, the dehydration, the cuts and the bruises that they had on them were in fact bodily harm. And after hearing these children's testimonies and seeing the evidence, the jury convicted all 3 men to life without the possibility of parole. However, the men, all 3, appealed the 8 counts of bodily harm, which was then overturned, and they had to be resentenced. And when they were resentenced, they were then given life with parole. In 2012, after 36 years in prison, Rich Schoenfeld was released. Then, not long after, in 2015, Jim Schoenfeld was released at the age of 63. However, Fred didn't get out as quickly as they did, because as it turns out, he had been running an illegal car business from prison with his parents' trust fund money. This boggles my brain. Can someone please explain to me how you're running an illegal business, and why do you have access to a trust fund when you're in prison? He was also caught with contraband, pornography, and cell phones, etc. And although he did apply, he was denied parole 19 times. But at the age of 70, he was finally released. But I mean, he got out and he's still filthy rich, so he's pretty much living his best life. A lot of these victims are still affected to this day. This isn't something you just get over. And even our star hero, 14-year-old Mike, had a really rough go in life. He took some bad turns, but from what I could find, it looks like he's doing well for himself, and he's turned things around and is very happy. Ed was awarded an award for outstanding citizenship, and he's still looked at as the town hero for keeping everyone safe. The majority of the identities of the remaining children that were on that bus have been kept confidential. So I don't know and can't report sadly how they're doing, but I do wish that all of them are doing well and have found peace in their lives. I really appreciate you guys watching this today and listening to this insane story. I hope you're going to join me again for Crafty Criminals when we talk about another crafty criminal and do some kind of fun project together. Take care. Bye.